Good morning, everyone. Come on in, make yourself at home. We're going to give it a minute while we allow people to come into the room. I hope everyone is having a happy morning or a happy afternoon, wherever you're at. All right, well, welcome back to Fitzgerald Summer School. This is the first of two special sessions we're doing. We've had about 7 sessions so far, and we're very happy with the both the interest and the attendance on YouTube. This session is going to highlight our Keehl Donaldson Emerging Scholars winners. I do want to mention that our next regular session, session 7, will take place on Wednesday, July 7th at 1 p.m. and that'll feature 3 of our, we call them our Fitzgerald Studies rock stars, Jim West, Sarah Churchwell, and David Brown, who have a fun sort of game of stump the audience here, going deep into the 1920s and 30s to teach us some of the thinkers and politicians and pop cultural events that we have overlooked in Fitzgerald studies. After that, on Monday, July 12th, we will have our Where in the World Are Scott and Zelda, where we have been filming some Zoom trips to different exotic locales, not the obvious ones, that we've been to in recent years. And then finally, our second special session will, and the end of Fitzgerald Summer School, will be Wednesday, July 14th at 1 o'clock, and that will be a writing and publishing workshop that we're co-sponsoring with the Hemingway Society. We'll be handing off the baton to them since they have programming that starts on Friday the 16th. So we hope you'll join us and tune in for all of those events. We're very excited this morning, however, to introduce you to 9 of this year's Keehl Donaldson Fellowship Award, Travel Fellowship Award winners. And hosting this particular session is my good friend and colleague, Dr. Ross Tangadal. So I'm going to introduce him and turn things over. I will be removing my camera so we can feature all of the much younger and better looking people than myself. Ross is assistant professor of English and director of Cornerstone Press at the University of Wisconsin Superior. Is that right? It's SP, sorry.
Stevens Point.
Stevens Point. I'm sorry. I should have
It's all
known
right.
that.
There's a lot of them.
He specializes in American print and publishing culture with an emphasis in book history, textual editing, bibliography, and authorship. He has a great book forthcoming that I encourage everybody to be on the lookout for, called The Preface, American Authorship in the 20th Century. Excellent analysis of paratextuality and some of our leading modernists. And he also recently co-edited Editing the Harlem Renaissance from Clemson just this year. And he's also co-editor of Michigan Salvage, Bonnie Jo Campbell in the American Midwest, which is coming from Michigan State University Press. So he has been a machine lately, and we're very excited to see that. Of course, many of us always remember Ross as a graduate student himself, starting out not that long ago, and was actually one of the recipients of the Keehl Donaldson Award. So Ross, I'm going to turn it over to you. I have a note to turn on speaker view. And then I am very excited, and I just want to say to our 9 fellowship winners, thank you very much for your interest in Fitzgerald Societies. And I know some of you are return visitors to this conference, but I am very grateful as well for the new folks that are here. And I hope this marks um, your your first, but not your last by any means, adventures in Fitzgerald scholarship. All right, Ross, take it away.
Very good. Well, thank you, Kirk, for that generous introduction. I'm particularly pleased to be moderating this panel. Again, I was a recipient of what was then called the Kuehl Fellowship for our Montgomery conference back in 2013 in Montgomery, Alabama. And it's there I met for the first time in person. Unfortunately, we can't replicate that with all of you. We hope in Fitzgerald conferences in the future, we will be able to meet you in person if you are able to participate. But it was there that I met so many of the people that have become important to my Fitzgerald Studies life. So welcome all of you, and thank you for the work that you do and for the work that is developing. It's exciting to see new work from the younger generation moving forward. So today is a pretty straightforward model. I'm going to back out and allow these 9 individuals to showcase their work. One is a group of 3, so that one will operate just a little bit differently than the others. But essentially, if there is a PowerPoint or presentation, they will share their screen and they will discuss their work. So for now, here we go. I'm going to introduce our first panelist, and then I will also remove my video, and that will allow the panelists to showcase their work individually. So first is Nicholas Erlandson. Nicholas, take it away.
Oh, thank you. Yeah, good day, everyone, or good morning, those of you in America. First, let me just say that it's truly an honor for me to be here. My name is Nicholas Erlandson. I just graduated from Linnaeus University in Sweden with a master's degree in English and another master's in secondary education. I am interested in the mind narrative nexus and how we engage with stories on a cognitive level. So my research involves cognitive narratology and how narrative taps into readers' familiarity with experiences to make stories more immersive. I'm just going to see if I can share my presentation with you. I'm hoping that everyone is seeing this. I'm just going to go right there. All right. So yeah, this paper is titled Experientiality in Fitzgerald's Short Story Narration. So literary realism attempts to represent familiar things as they are. James Nigel once said that The Great Gatsby makes a perfect example of American literary realism because of its realistic and evolving characters and unreliable narrator. Realistic narrators, he notes, are often unreliable because they convey a subjective, more human-like perspective. So an example would be, for instance, how Nick Carraway based a lot of his story on events relayed to him from multiple sources in Gatsby. The realism then pulls from the subjectiveness of an experience to provide it with more texture. Now, although this disposition has merit from a narratologist's point of view, another important aspect of narrative's realism is the way that readers are invited to simulate characters' experiences by attributing to them a conscious qualia from which these experiences are perceived. Now, qualia here is defined in line with philosopher Daniel Dennett as the way that something appears to the experiencer at a certain time and place. So take the Tarleton trilogy, for instance, offers a variety of sounds and smells that increase the way that we engage with the stories through multisensory integration. And this was addressed by, for instance, Niklas Salmose in his conference paper, The Sounds and Smells of the South. The immersion that follows such sensory-focused imagery pulls from and revitalizes what Monica Fludernick calls experientiality, meaning she states, and I quote, the quasi-mimetic evocation of real-life experience, unquote. Or put differently, how narrative caters to readers' experiential familiarity using cognitive and sensorial configurations, which make readers reconstruct these experiences internally. So multisensory integration enhances narrative's experientiality and allows reader to perceive represented phenomenological experiences through their different sensory receptors, and they simulate a real-life experience. So in this way, represented experiences in Fitzgerald's narration are kind of measured against our familiarity with previous experience, which invites us to reconstruct and simulate them. And this kind of experiential phenomenology is utilized in much of Fitzgerald's narration techniques, and is particularly evident in his short stories. So I'm just going to give you a little example. So one example in which such, sensory focused experientiality can be seen is in the beginning of this short story. It's Fitzgerald's 1931 short story, A New Leaf. And in this quote, to give you some context, Julia Ross, Phil Hoffman are sitting down eating at an outdoor cafe in a Paris park. And this is early spring of 1929. And I quote, "It was the first day, warm enough to eat outdoors in the Bois de Boulogne, while chestnut blossoms slanted down across the tables and dropped impudently into the butter and the wine. Julia Ross ate a few with her bread and listened to the big goldfish rippling in the pool and the sparrows whirring about an abandoned table." This kind of narration evokes a texture of experience, as it allows us to simulate it through our own sensory organs. So note how the narrator caters kind of to our different senses as we absorb this scene. So first, there's the imagery associated with our visual senses, as the branches of blossoms lean down toward the table. They then engage our tactile visual senses, as we are invited to envision the texture of the butter and the liquidity of the wine as they are touched by the blossoms. As Julia eats, the story engages with our gustatory sense as she eats the chestnuts, while combining it with the visual oral experience, of the sounds of the goldfish rippling in the nearby water and the sparrow flapping its wings nearby. This interaction between Julia's qualia and our familiarity with the senses enhances reality in Fitzgerald's stories, as they enable us to immerse ourselves in them on a cognitive and embodied level. Fitzgerald's stories are immersive not only because of his strong metaphors and rhetorical strategies, but also because his descriptive language establishes a strong experiential ethos that is anchored in our familiarity with the represented experience that he conveyed. By using strong sensory-focused language, he builds rapport with his audience on a more cognitive level, which invites his audience, to simulate the experiences internally as they interact with his characters. Raymond Chandler once wrote of Fitzgerald that it's not a matter of, and I quote, "It's not a matter of pretty writing or clear style. It's the kind of subdued magic, controlled and exquisite, the sort of thing you get from good string quartets." And like a string quartet requires, individual instruments to fully convey the musical soundscape for an intended genre. Represented subjective experiences are more immersive if we experience them through all of our senses. So A New Leaf and several others of Fitzgerald's stories contain descriptive experiential imagery, which taps into our cognitive and embodied repertoire. So in this sense, readers simulate the represented phenomenological experience using all or most of their senses, and just like they do in real life. So that was it. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you, Nicholas. So our next presenter, let me pull up I've got my little list here. Our next presenter will be Francesca Mancino. Francesca, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I'm going to share my screen, so just one moment. Okay, so I'm going to discuss Keatsian echoes of synesthesia in Fitzgerald's corpus. So Nicholas, this goes very well into your presentation. Oops. Okay, so to begin, I'm so sorry for that background noise. In a letter dated August 3rd, 1940, only months before his untimely death, F. Scott Fitzgerald writes to his then 18-year-old daughter, Scottie, "For a while after you quit Keats, all other poetry seems to be only whistling and humming." This sentiment, along with Keatsian references throughout Fitzgerald's corpus, poses the question, how do we see Keats in Fitzgerald's work in ways that are less blatant than, say, the title of Tender's the Night, being pulled from Ode to a Nightingale? If we consider Fitzgerald's writing style broadly, it tends to straddle between poetry and prose, interweaved with Keatsian-like melodies and Keatsian echoes from a stylistic standpoint frequently reverberate in Fitzgerald's writing, to the extent that if I refer to a phrase like, quote, "too full of joy in soft, delicious warmth," unquote, and conceal the author, doesn't it sound as if either wrote it? Though the quote is taken from Keats's Hyperion, Keats and Fitzgerald's have a characteristic fluidity that can be attributed in part to synesthesic metaphors or the linguistic manipulation of duly experienced sensory perceptions. The soft deliciousness, or the juxtaposition between taste and touch, paradoxically enriches a warmth that can be felt in a way that transcends what language can't capture. So combining touch with taste, therefore elevates the sensory experience and giving it a duality in spite of the inability, at least for non-synesthetes, to taste when touched. Though up to this point, I focused a bit more on Keats, I do so to lay a foundation of what can be categorized as a synesthetic metaphor. Though labels widely differ among scholars, nonetheless, in highlighting sensory-related metaphors in Keats and Fitzgerald's work, I intend to emphasize how the influence of Keats manifests in Fitzgerald's writing beyond glaring verbatims or references to the poet. I'm not positing that Keats and Fitzgerald are synesthetes, but rather I find them to link sensory perceptions in a way that non-synesthetes can only attempt to feel when amalgamating disparate sensory experiences. One of the most prevalent similarities in regards to synesthesia in both Keats and Fitzgerald's work concerns the fusion of sound and taste, typically when describing music. Beginning with Keats, some of his most well-known verses are found in Ode on a Grecian Urn. Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. Therefore, ye soft pipes, play on, not to the sensual ear, but more endeared. Pipe to the spirit ditties of no tone. Thus unheard, yet sweeter melodies will not appeal to an ear capable of hearing, but to the toneless ditties of the spirit. So synesthesia becomes paradoxical, as it's what cannot be heard that metaphorically tastes sweeter than what can be heard. But the way in which Daisy's voice sweetly parallels a rising melody represents the sweetness of heard melodies, though Fitzgerald does not concur, at least in The Great Gatsby, that unheard melodies are sweeter. Also in Gatsby, we see the sound of music described in terms of color, where sight and sound coalesce. Quote, "Now the orchestra is playing yellow cocktail music," unquote. Though we can rashly label yellow as a symbol of vivaciousness or ostentatiousness, its significance remains shrouded in mystique, seen in T.J. Ecclesburg's, quote, "enormous yellow spectacles," unquote. The crumbled wasteland is seen through them rather than his eyes. Gatsby's, quote, "nice yellow," unquote, car. Also, with the disappearing yellowing trees that Gatsby goes through when walking to his pool before his death. With these scenes in mind, it's plausible that yellow represents an imminent blighting of all things. Thus, yellow music, the wasteland seen through T.J. Ecclesburg's yellow-rimmed glasses, and Gatsby's car, which marks an end to Wilson's sanity and Myrtle's life, dissolves earthly eternity as the yellow trees lead Gatsby to his demise. Continuing with the sense of sound, it becomes fused with the sense of touch as well. Seen in Keats's The Eve of St. Agnes, one's, quote, "ear touches the melody," unquote. Here the melody is listened to so attentively that the ear and a physicalized melody delicately interact. Fitzgerald does something very similar and almost identical to Keats in describing sound and touch, though he laces the complexity of memory into this description. In this side of paradise, he writes, quote, a few phrases sang or rang in Amory's ear and touched a faint chord of memory. The intensity of their relationship between sound and touch seems so visceral that they're almost interchangeable. Further, the quote, faint chord, unquote, is reminiscent of a soft strum of music, where sound metaphorically harmonizes with touch as daintily as one's hands press against a piano's keys. Also, in this side of paradise, Fitzgerald uses music as a medium in which Amory and others can almost experience the sense of touch. When the gramophone plays Poor Butterfly, the song of last year, it is evocative of the war, which now, quote, seems scarcely to touch them, unquote. The integration of scarcely, like faint, reveals to the reader that the imprint of memory is more indelible than Fitzgerald lets on. Each of the aforementioned quotes may seem like incongruous phrasing, a term used by June Downey in her 1912 study of literary synesthesia. In her article, she presents subjects with synesthetic fragments of poetry, written by Keats, Shelley, Blake, and others to measure their aesthetic and affective values. Downey's research, over a century later, continues to prompt the questions if and how we can gauge literary synesthesia, both subjectively and objectively. From a broader perspective, is it fruitless to wonder if synesthetic metaphors work? Furthermore, why did some quotes appeal to you more than others? Is it because we identify with, enjoy, or are more familiar with a particular sense? The problem with this question is that subjectivity inevitably clouds our interpretations. Though the statement sounds obvious, Drs. John Harrison and Simon Baron-Cohen researched this precise conundrum in their joint study, Synesthesia, Reconciling the Subjective with the Objective. In spite of neurological advancements made since the study's publication in 1995, their conflicts persist today. In spite of PET scans, it is still, quote, difficult to reconcile the subjective experiences of synesthetes with the objective views of science. However, in light of Keats and Fitzgerald's synesthetic depictions, I want to emphasize that they aren't rendering an experience as lived by a synesthete, but they juxtapose sensory perceptions to appeal and intensify metaphor. The relationship between metaphor and synesthesia, however, is fraught. Danny Cavallaro, in her 2013 book, Synesthesia and the Arts, writes, quote, some researchers aver that metaphor does not constitute real synesthesia, insofar as synesthesia's connections are natural and unplanned, whereas metaphor's connections are intentional and calculated, unquote. Cavallaro cites Harrison and Baron-Cohen, who designate metaphor as pseudo-synesthesia, maintaining that it is voluntary and that a person resorting to sense-blending metaphors to impart language with specific moods will readily admit that the description is only an analogy. From a more aged perspective, but no less relevant, June Downey categorizes the relationship between synesthesia and metaphor as sense analogies, and later in 1957, Glennon O'Malley's article coins the term inner sense metaphor, which may imply a sort of introspection into basic processes of experience, a mirroring or echoing of the mind and senses to themselves in the act of apprehending phenomena. While O'Malley states this perceptual interplay is not at all uncomplicated, he asserts that there is a, quote, inescapable oddness and mystery about inner sense harmony, its supersensuousness, so to speak, which imaginative adaptations of synesthetic expression often hopes to exploit, unquote. I don't think that Keats or Fitzgerald, two romantic writers, if we can categorize Fitzgerald as such, attempt to transcend, quote, ordinary experience, unquote, as O'Malley suggests. Rather, they strive to converge the representation of sensory experience via language to adequately gauge, quote, supersensuousness, to use O'Malley's interesting word, despite the two overarching ideas I grapple with, such as attempting to situate literary synesthesia in Keats and Fitzgerald's corpora, in the particulars of synesthetic metaphors, I find the connection between both of them to be relevant. Aside from blatant references to Keats and Fitzgerald's work, such as mentions of Keats found in that novel, and in addition to This Side of Paradise, The Beautiful and the Damned, and The Crack-Up, it is not too far-fetched to study these less obvious parallels between Keats and Fitzgerald. The latter claimed to have read what he refers to as the Grecian urn 100 times, finding it unbearably beautiful. In that same letter to Scottie that I referenced at the very beginning, we can see how the influence of Keats upon Fitzgerald, possibly unconsciously, infiltrates Fitzgerald's own writing style. Interestingly, he holds that hearing, rather than seeing or a combination of both senses, is necessary to fully apprehend Keats. He proclaims to Scottie that, quote, knowing those things, such as found in Keats's poetry, very young and granted an ear, one could scarcely ever afterwards be unable to distinguish between gold and dross in one what read. That is the end of my presentation.
Thank you, Francesca. Next, we will have Robert Steltenpool. Robert.
Hi, everyone. I'm a PhD candidate at the University of Amsterdam, and my work focuses on cultures of aging in the early works of F. Scott Fitzgerald. And I've been working on a chapter on party making and party going. And for today, I made a short expose that I hope is both interesting and entertaining. Let me set myself up here. Quote, ladies and gentlemen, this is Fred. Who is Fred, you may wonder? Well, the other guests in The Beautiful and Damned wonder the same thing, since no one can quite remember where they know him from or grasp why he has turned up at the party. Fred, however, keeps insisting that they do know him. Quote, you've forgotten Fred Paramore? We were both in Uncle Robert's history class. Many of Fitzgerald's parties are populated by liminal partygoers, shifting from not quite invited, not entirely unwelcome, to outright party crasher, depending on context. Nick Carraway in The Great Gatsby, for instance, muses that, quote, I was one of the few guests who had actually been invited. People were not invited, they went there. In this brief showcase, I want to focus on a particular transitional party figure, Fred Paramore, because he lends the party its critical importance as a site of contested knowledge, production, and shifting perspectives. Both outsider and insider, guest, interloper, participant, witness, observer, secret agent. Paramore questions what is real and who might potentially be a fraud. Since not everyone is familiar with The Beautiful and Damned, it is useful at this point to briefly set the scene. Paramore turns up in the defining alcoholic spree of The Beautiful and Damned, The Broken Lute. The party is the culmination of a crisis that had been brewing for the first half of the novel. Anthony and Gloria Patch, married for about a year, had been enjoying a carefree and sumptuous lifestyle, with the expectation that he would inherit his grandfather's fortune. But this comes to an abrupt end when his grandfather, a vehement supporter of the prohibition cause, makes a surprise visit. After witnessing the disorderly bacchanal, the reformer among reformers leaves in horror, and Anthony is promptly disinherited. Paramore's presence at the party immediately raises some eyebrows amongst the other guests. He also appears to play a double role, to which we will return later. At first glance, it appears that Paramore's role as a literary device is simply comic relief. He is especially the focus of Maury Noble's word games and jokes. Maury, a close friend of Anthony Patch, known for his brilliance, but also for his, quote, indolence, irreverence, and his easy mockery, has no patience for this goody two-shoes who responds to any question in the most respectable way. When Paramore explains his work as a social worker, Maury interjects by suggesting immediate electrocution for, quote, all ignorant and dirty people. Some of you might know this Maury type partygoer who, totally bored with pedestrian, colorless individuals, turn flippant and try to lure out hapless guests with exceedingly strange, offensive points of view. Paramore does not take the bait, even when Maury doubles down and becomes outright abusive. At this point, we might wonder if Paramore is not as stupid as his other guests presume him to be. For let us consider, the options open to Paramore are limited. 1, become angry and acknowledge the behavior. 2, try to outwit Maury without raising the issue. Or 3, just ignore it altogether and carry on the conversation. Paramore's continued civilized discourse and his litany of truisms can be seen as a kind of silence, since it does not tell anything to anyone. It is this spoken silence that drives Maury to double down on his nihilist outlook and at some point to give up altogether. Even though Paramore is an obvious Protestant abstainer, Maury cajoles him to start drinking and join the party in earnest. Paramore's tireless good table manners have thus served as an impenetrable shield, a disguise that hides his ulterior motives. Paramore thus appears to us as an unmovable subject, the unwavering social worker caught up in strange surroundings. If we look beyond this opaque wall of respectable discourse, however, he becomes increasingly suspicious. Firstly, the narrator's description of him is obviously meant to raise alarm. Paramore is but, quote, vaguely associated with Harvard, looks like, quote, an amateur pickpocket, and might be involved in, quote, organized crime. Secondly, there is the context of his visit. Strangely enough, he is the first to arrive at the party and offer a vague reason for his visit. In a moment of clarity, Anthony appears to grasp at some ulterior motive. Paramore, quote, probably came up to me to wheedle some money out of grandfather for his flock. His flock denoting the social work he has devoted his life to. This appears to be an entirely plausible scheme, since Anthony's grandfather had just, quote, that morning made a contribution of $50,000 to the cause of national prohibition. In addition, there is, I will argue, enough textual evidence to allow an even more suspicious reading. Asked about his occupation, Paramore answers that he writes nonfiction. Following this, the narrator offers up the following ambiguous reasoning, quote, whether Paramore is lingering in the Grey House out of politeness or curiosity, or in order at some future time to make a sociological report on the decadence of American life, is problematical. It is thus problematical, but entirely possible, that Paramore has snuck into an alien, decadent world as a kind of secret agent, and in the hopes of writing about it later. When Maury jokes that the Japanese Tana, the household servant, might be a German agent in the house, a cautious smile appears on Paramore's face. He, of course, is the real secret agent. Any remaining doubt is removed by the drunken truth Paramore blurts out at the party's denouement. Quote, I'm not a guest here, I work here. This line is as funny as it is poignant. He was never really a guest there, but working, making mental notes of the, in his Puritan eyes, decadent depravity at the heart of American upper-class society. On a final note, he might also have fed the flames as an agent provocateur. One odd fact stands out. At the beginning of the party, when he is the only guest there is a phone call. We are provided with a fragmented account, but it is obvious that the caller Butterworth is actually the assistant of Anthony's grandfather, Shuttleworth. The assistant has called ahead to announce their visit, but Paramore neglects to inform Anthony, or anyone else for that matter, that there had been a call. A surprising fact given his otherwise rigorous moral codes and adherence to proper social conduct. Had he alerted Anthony in time, before the effect of alcohol had taken hold, the entire drama leading to his disinheritance might have been altogether avoided. Paramore's actions, therefore, at Anthony's party, both overt and covert, give it a distinctly modern character. This is especially true for the grating and difficult interactions between Maury and Paramore. Here, different rhetorical styles and ideas are presented in a manner that undermine, as Christopher Ames puts it, quote, Fitzgerald's festive vision with its, quote, multivocal potential. Paramore also embodies what Kate McLaughlin describes as the, quote, twin propensities, unquote, of the modernist cocktail party, with its, quote, constructive enlightenment and destructive excess. The forbidden contraband that Paramore sneaks into the party is the enlightenment of a newfangled science, his social work, and his mission to write non-fiction. The destructive excess is also obvious in Paramore's role as a first-time drinker and agent provocateur. As a final coda in an attempt to understand the who is this Fred, there is a historical source for Paramore. He is based on Ted Paramore, who visited the Fitzgeralds in St. Paul in 1921. This Ted Paramore went on to have a successful career as a writer of both fiction and nonfiction. Thank you.
The floor is yours. Thank you, Robert. Next, we have Laura Rodriguez-Zivica. Laura, the floor is yours.
Thank you. I think I'll start with sharing my screen. Does everyone see that properly? Yeah. Hi, my name is Lara and I'm a PhD student at Umeå University, Sweden. My project, which is still very much in development, focuses on Fitzgerald's short stories as they were first published in popular magazines. Using an intermedial approach, I examine how different paratexts and media types, such as narrative text, illustrations, and advertisements interact and make meaning together in the magazine pages. I'm also interested in how the intermedial framework could be a relevant tool to study the new illustrated formats that are emerging. For example, the recent Gatsby graphic novels, and also in Spain, Fitzgerald's stories are often being marketed individually and accompanied by several illustrations. Scholarly interest in Fitzgerald's magazine stories is emerging. As we saw in the This is a Magazine webinar 2 weeks ago, scholars Jennifer Nolan, Bryant Mangum, Michael Weisenberg, and Barbara Green discussed the importance of studying Fitzgerald's work in their periodical context. And Nolan's work on the text-image relations and bibliographical codes in these stories has been very important. One reason for the previous lack of scholarly output is that they're still generally difficult to access, despite new resources and advances in digitization. Precisely due to this practical issue, it was at first challenging for me to find Winter Dreams, which, according to scholarly sources in Fitzgerald's ledger, was first published in New York-based Metropolitan Magazine in December 1922. Instead, I first stumbled on a version in Canadian magazine Maclean's, which, to my surprise, was published a month earlier. Eventually, I got a hold of a copy of the Metropolitan Issue 2 from the Matthew J. and Arlen Berkeley collection at the Irvin Department of Rare Books and Special Collections. Interconnectedness is a key characteristic of intermediality. It is often connected to intertextuality in how texts are understood in connection to other texts. Miko Letonon defines intermediality as intertextuality transgressing media boundaries, focusing on how different media types engage with each other. In this presentation, I'll explore some examples of this in 2 magazine versions of Winter Dreams, which feature several layers of interconnectedness. For example, between Fitzgerald as a protagonist of youth, the youthful flappers on the covers, the illustrations of young and attractive couples, as well as the stories and the advertisements' reflection of the collective anxiety towards aging prevalent in the jazz age. When I first saw the first pages of both versions together, I found it remarkable that despite sharing the same illustrator, Arthur William Brown, each page enhanced a different aspect of the story, creating different expectations in the reader. The first pages of these magazines are usually proleptic and are all about anticipation. Maclean's on the left side seems to create expectations of a rivalry between 2 women who are placed in diagonal opposition to each other. Judy and Irene are not yet named here, and we encounter them later in the story. But the captions, one on Dexter's evaluation of Judy's dress and the other on Irene's popularity, strongly hint at a male presence that will figure in this contest. In terms of characterization, Irene's confidently posing figure, placed in the center, seems to contradict her insignificance to Dexter in the text. Metropolitan, to the right, gives the impression that a romance between Dexter and Judy will take center stage. I would also argue that their somber expressions and faraway gazes suggest a doomed romance to come, long before it was hinted in the text. In the following pages, both proleptic images of the couple are large and centrally placed, the Metropolitan version even taking up the entire page. Looking at Maclean's to the left, interestingly, in the text that corresponds to the image, the scene occurs in a dark garden. The illustration's garden, however, is sunny and flowering, creating an idealized picture of the couple. Moreover, the frame around the image is reminiscent of a picture frame and the photographical medium, which is associated with capturing the past. The idealized image in this way becomes nostalgic. The magazines were a crucial part of the swiftly evolving media landscape of the 1920s, and advertisements were a driving force behind them. As Theodore Peterson notes, the reader became primarily a consumer. I will argue that a close look at the advertising medium reveals how it both thematically relates to the story and echoes current collective concerns. For example, in the last section of the story in Maclean's, we read about the definitive end of Dexter and Judy's romance. This is followed by Dexter's shock at finding out that Judy is no longer the great beauty he remembers. The discussion on her faded looks is positioned right next to a large advertisement for face cream. The headline, "Watch Your Skin," is accompanied by an illustration of a sportive young woman who, just like Judy, enjoys golf. The ad warns, if you play golf, you must care for your skin. Thus, the advertisement, which we normally don't connect to the storyline, seems to engage directly with it. In the same way, in Metropolitan, Dexter's nostalgia for an irrecoverable love and youth is positioned within the obsession with youth culture manifest in the ads. Again, towards the end, the advertisements show pictures of young, beautiful people. There's an ad for hair dye and another ad for a book by bodybuilder Lionel Strongfort, who is named The Perfect Man. Looking at another paratextual element, the serialized novel Flaming Youth also fits into this media web of youth idealization. In sum, employing an intermediate lens to examine how the different media and paratexts relate to Fitzgerald's story in these 2 magazine versions of Winter Dreams, I endeavor to show how these engage in similar ways that parallel the themes of the story. On a broader plane, these media and paratexts seem to work in tandem to project the prevalent exaltation of youth at the time. Thanks so much for listening.
Thank you, Laura. Okay, moving right along. We're about halfway home. Our next panelist is Cameron Sowers. Cameron, the floor.
All right, thank you. I'm gonna go ahead and share my screen now for my PowerPoint. And can everyone see that all right? All right, great. So hi, my name is Cameron Sowers. I just graduated from Gettysburg College in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. This past May, I'll be starting in the graduate history program at the University of Kentucky this fall. In response to the murder of George Floyd and a resurgent Black Lives Matter movement, communities across the country and indeed the globe began to reckon with the complicated meaning of public commemorative spaces, particularly Confederate monuments. Historians of the Civil War era have spent significant energy over the last decade studying America's contested memories of the Civil War, as best exemplified by Carolyn Janey's Remembering the Civil War. These works analyze everything from the monument's structural compositions, the speeches that dedicate them, and the ceremonies that take place at their base each year. These ceremonies, as America has shown, continue to take place each year. This paper uses the same power of place to examine the relationship between visits we know Fitzgerald made to Confederate heritage sites with his outlook on the early 20th century South and his writing about the legacy of the American Civil War. Scholars such as Milton Stern, John Callahan, and Scott Donaldson have argued for the importance of history in shaping Fitzgerald's writing. Only Frederick Wengner has produced a focused exploration of Fitzgerald in the Civil War. I instead look to Michael Gore's recent work on William Faulkner and the Civil War as a powerful example of the effective combination of history, memory studies, and literary criticism. Fitzgerald has found himself outside the pantheon of our great writers of the Civil War, despite the war's near constant presence in his writing. My hope is that scholars of Fitzgerald will recognize that the Jazz Age was also an incredibly fraught time in memory of the American Civil War. This includes recognizing that the contemporary process of reconciliation, making the former Confederacy socially whole with the Union, came at the expense of African-American memory of the Civil War, something Fitzgerald himself writes a part of. Scott's early childhood stories about the Civil War were influenced by two main sources, the historical fiction of G.A. Henty and his father's own experiences as a child in Civil War era Maryland. These experiences imbue Scott with a romantic view of the South, much like Amory Blaine, who admits to finding something romantic in the Confederate South. Amory uses the term lost cause in the lowercase, like John Irwin does in the quote at the bottom of this screen. Whether he realized it or not, Irwin got to the heart of the lost cause, a term with a loaded meaning for Civil War historians. The term lost cause is first used by Edward Pollard in his 1866 book, The Lost Cause, a new Southern history of the War of the Confederates and its 1868 follow-up. The term lost cause is now capitalized by Civil War historians who use it to define the pseudo-historical myth that justifies and romanticizes the Confederacy. The lost cause ideology's central tenets claim slavery to be a benign, even benevolent institution, while also denying its centrality to the origins of the war. The lost cause heroicizes Confederate soldiers from Robert E. Lee all the way down to the common Confederate soldier and endows them with personal value superior to that of federal soldiers. Contemporary to Pollard, this lost cause was used by white Confederate sympathizers to advocate for white supremacy and strip African Americans of their newfound political rights. The lost cause shapes the romance of reunion, where white Northerners abandon the progress of Reconstruction to socially reunite with the South. This concept of reunion is best summarized by William McKinley's 1898 speech to the Georgia House of Representatives, where he declares sectional feelings no longer hold back the love we bear for each other. Fraternity is the national anthem, sung by a chorus of 45 states. So what does any of that have to do with Fitzgerald? Well, in 1917, a young Fitzgerald is stationed at Camp Sheridan in Montgomery, Alabama. We see here in the center, there's the photo of Scott with his regiment, and also on the right side, a souvenir postcard of Camp Sheridan, which I think is worth noting that does not depict Phil Sheridan as the dashing hero of the Union war effort, but as an aging veteran of the 1880s as reconciliation began to take hold. While he is stationed at Camp Sheridan, the young Fitzgerald begins courting local belle Zelda Sayer. The couple spends time in Montgomery's Oakwood Cemetery, which contains the grave of some 750 Confederate soldiers and remains as Montgomery's oldest cemetery. A visit to this cemetery prompts prompts intense emotional reflection in two pieces that I have presented on this PowerPoint. For Sally Carroll, with a tear in her eye, she delivers the first quote that you see. She holds a romantic view of the beautiful so-called South, the dead South, what historians more commonly call the Old South, notably the slaveholding South, and cries about the decline of masculine chivalry after the war, a frequent theme in Fitzgerald's writing. Notably, Sally was told these stories of the not-so-distant past by a Confederate veteran, many of whom were still alive in the 19-teens and were a constant presence at events that celebrated the Confederate tradition and passed on to the next generation, Scott and Zelda's generation, an important reverence for a way of life seemingly gone by. While Scott was away in New York, Zelda writes the second quote that you see on the PowerPoint slide, which Scott uses nearly word for word in the concluding passages of This Side of Paradise. Zelda's quote seems to have little to do with the Civil War, except for it demonstrates the cemetery as a social space in the late 19th and early 20th century. Zelda finding romantic beauty in the Confederate graves demonstrates the efficacy of the social programming of ladies' memorial associations and their successor organizations, the United Daughters of the Confederacy, who made Confederate cemeteries important social spaces in the late 19th and early 20th century South. Montgomery's Oakwood Cemetery predates the Civil War, but like cemeteries across the nation, its form and meaning are drastically altered by the Civil War. The repatriation of Confederate war dead to Pacific cemetery sections was overseen by Confederate heritage organizations, broadly encompassed under the term Ladies' Memorial Associations. Montgomery's own chapter of the Ladies' Memorial Association was founded on April 14, 1866, exactly 1 year after Abraham Lincoln's assassination. One of the leaders was Mary Ann Phelan, who lost two sons during the war, including one Watkins, whose grave is pictured on this PowerPoint slide. The organization raised money for the burial of the initial group of 200 Confederate dead, and by the end of the 1860s, they had built an obelisk and a pavilion from which Confederate Memorial Day is still celebrated each year. Organizations like the Montgomery's Ladies Memorial Association were and still remain the central articulators of lost cause ideology. They sponsored the places, events, and monuments that have indelibly shaped understandings of the Southern defeat. They took on important significance in the wake of the war by honoring the dead, who were heroic for never having surrendered. Southerners preserved what they perceived to be the heroic past, while also ritually acknowledging the Confederate insurrection had been defeated. These cemeteries played host to ritual events like Confederate Memorial Days that allowed Southerners to escape the changing tensions of their world, namely the progress of Reconstruction, by creating a sense of community and continuity rooted in white supremacy. Some 50 years before we see Fitzgerald write about Montgomery's Oakwood Cemetery, memoirist Elise Virginia Jones Vast wrote also about Oakwood Cemetery, describing an attack on a Black religious meeting near Oakwood Cemetery launched by the local chapter of the Ku Klux Klan. Throughout the 19th century and into the early 20th century, memorialization of the Civil War was led by the generation that had fought in the war, the aging gentlemen of Camp Lomax, which was located in Montgomery, who erected a memorial arch in Oakwood Cemetery, stand on the right side as an example of this. But also frequent at these ceremonies were columns of young white children who frequented parades and laid flowers at graves on Confederate Memorial Day. Given Judge Sayer's prominence in the local community, Zelda's participation in these parades would be unsurprising. The photo of the aging veterans also alludes to the successors of the original articulators of the lost cause. Their successor organizations, the Sons of the Confederate Veterans and the United Daughters of the Confederacy, held more than 45,000 members by 1912 and were less than shy in their defense of white supremacy. The UDC focused on creating programming that encouraged future generations to uphold the Confederate generation's honor, virtue, and defense of constitutional rights. Judging by the views that Scott and Zelda express in the earlier passages, the UDC programming seemed to have impacted Scott. Though born in St. Paul and spending most of his life in the North up until this point, he still finds himself seduced by the romance of reunion and the lost cause ideology. So when we label Scott a Southern writer, as Irwin and Donaldson have done, and something I would agree to, we must understand the complete historical baggage that comes with being labeled a Southern writer in the early 20th century. In another visit to a Confederate heritage site immortalized in Cruise of the Rolling Junk, Scott and Zelda stop in Richmond, Virginia's Museum of the Confederacy, which was then located in the former Confederate White House. It's a brief visit and brief passage in the Rolling Junk, but I think it bears looking at. The Ladies Memorial Associations established it in 1896 with a dedication speech from Trip O'Farrell that remarked that as grand as the South was in her sons, she was still grander in her daughters. The goal of the museum was to preserve the Confederate legacy for future generations. Its possessions were not artifacts, but sacred relics of the glorious days that serve as a living monument to the Confederacy. The museum was intended to be a source of motivation, inspiration, and patriotism for white Southerners, though Scott finds something romantic in it as well. So what does this all mean? In conclusion, this is a branch of a larger project that looks at the relationship between Fitzgerald and the tensions of Civil War memory. This paper shows that what Fitzgerald knew of the Civil War was the stuff of memory, the statues, stories, and organizations that produced a romantic narrative of the White South during the Civil War era. To borrow from Michael Gore's recent work on Faulkner, Fitzgerald exists at once in the lost cause and the lost generation, in which the seeming purpose and heroism of the Confederate past squats over an apparently meaningless present. My hope is that as the nation continues to reckon with the long reach of the Civil War and its memory, we will more fully recognize its permeation into American culture. For Fitzgerald scholars, it remains on us to continue to examine how a writer most known for his articulations of a jazz age present found himself enchanted and trapped by the forces of history. Thank you.
The floor is yours. Thank you, Cameron. Our next presenter is Richard Reisinger. Richard, the floor is yours.
Good morning and good day to everyone, depending on where you're tuning in from. I'm going to start, like our past few presenters, by sharing my screen. So give me just one moment to make that happen. Let's see. Is everybody able to see the screen and hear me? Okay, awesome. My name is Richard Reisinger. I am currently a PhD student at the University of South Florida that's located in Tampa, Florida. Much of my work deals with modernists as a whole and the concept of identity, however that may be represented or consciously performed. But lately, I have found myself consistently and constantly returning to Fitzgerald. I find some kind of scholarly interest, right, in bringing out the works that still have not seen quite as much scholarly attention as they could. Today's project is entitled The Revolt of the Angels, an archetypal analysis of Marjorie and Ardita in Fitzgerald's Flappers and Philosophers. Contained within Fitzgerald's 1920 short story collection entitled Flappers and Philosophers, Bernice Bobs Her Hair has enjoyed critical attention. It is consistently named as one of Fitzgerald's best stories, and several journals have published articles interested solely in explicating and analyzing it. The Offshore Pirate, on the other hand, has been largely written off as one of Fitzgerald's weaker offerings. Scholarship has also persistently referred to Marjorie and Ardita as flapper characters, a theory built upon Fitzgerald's almost inseparable link to popular culture, as well as the characters' rejection of previous societal norms to meld their personalities with that of the flapper woman. In spite of both negative and absent criticism, I will place the Offshore Pirate into direct conversation with Bernice Bobs Her Hair. In so doing, I will complicate the conceptualization of both Marjorie and Ardita as merely flappers. While certainly historically appropriate and signaled in the title of the short story collection, I nonetheless intend to suggest that this classification is limiting of Fitzgerald's characters. In response, I will discuss what I will name the Marjorie archetype, defined here as a young, high-class woman, a society vampire, if you will, that inevitably becomes jaded and cynical, and subsequently enacts or has enacted upon them some type of performative grandeur or dramatic disruption of normalcy in order to feel satisfied or contented once more. This paper will ultimately attempt to show that Ardita can be equated with Marjorie and that they both retreat into theatrics in order to satisfy the dullness or meaninglessness that they perceive in their respective high-class lives. To establish this archetype, it is necessary to remove the heroines of these stories from being fettered to the historic image of the flapper woman. The reasoning behind this is threefold. First, Fitzgerald's work has long been tied to historical context. This link brought about his rise to fame and his downfall, and subsequent scholarship has been a bit hesitant to push past the image of Fitzgerald as social historian. Second, Scott recognized and was vocal about his perception of the potential of flapperdom to be an empty ideal. As quoted in Ruth Pergosi's work, Fitzgerald himself saw flapperdom as, quote, a movement that had begun as a liberating force for women and society that had become a superficial display of personality and style. Scott's inherent distrust of the flapper movement denotes a hesitation to glorify complete adherence to its tenets. Finally, flapperdom, with all of its historical definitions and associated images, is a fixed cultural image. In contrast, an archetypal analysis allows the characters to be linked together through an approach that identifies their similarities in both characterization and motivations, while simultaneously acknowledging individual depth of character. It is important to establish the Marjorie archetype with its namesake, Marjorie herself. Fitzgerald begins Bernice Bobs Her Hair with a sweeping introduction that leads readers through a crowded ballroom and establishes the generational split between the dancers and their parents, notably the propensity of, quote, ladies over 35 to believe that younger set dance in the summertime with the very worst intentions in the world, end quote. It is within this space of distrust and paranoia that Fitzgerald can introduce an archetypal figure that is motivated specifically by negative feelings towards those who distrust her. Marjorie's rebellious nature is critical to our understanding of the Marjorie archetype. She actively rejects the image of her mother's generation, composed of, quote, inane females who are all very well in their own way, but know very little of their daughter's problems, end quote. Her sharp wit and tongue, coupled with her lack of fear or shame, implies that Marjorie is actively seeking to surpass the massive affectations exhibited by other society women. This motivation can also be clearly seen in her constant playing around with Warren's affections. As such, a major factor of this archetype is a propensity to disagree with and push back against older norms, a cynicism that represents feelings of constraint in response to societal expectations. Marjorie's inherent frustration with the antiquated norms espoused by her mother and by the watchers at the summer dances are obvious factors in her strong opposition to Bernice's willing adherence to them. Her attention to and social education of Bernice follows an outburst in which Marjorie links Bernice to girls who are, quote, responsible for all the tiresome, colorless marriages, all those ghastly inefficiencies that pass as feminine qualities, end quote. Thus, what follows is an attempt to inspire more rebellion. She takes Bernice through a series of lessons that are direct challenges to her mother's generation. Furthermore, Marjorie's social education of Bernice reveals several tenets that compose the Marjorie archetype. In Marjorie's eyes, independence can be claimed through social maneuvering. A girl can talk about anything as long as, quote, she looks like $1 million, end quote, and can attain poison charm in much the same way. In other words, a character that adheres to the Marjorie archetype values intelligence and beauty, but clearly prefers intelligence. For Marjorie, the two are inseparable. Marjorie's education of Bernice, though, can be seen not as a form of goodwill. Rather, it functions as dramatic disruption. What interests Marjorie and what bears the possibility of pulling her out of her malaise and sense of constraint is the entertainment of watching Bernice turn against her own mother, something Bernice herself seems unwilling to do. Marjorie's lack of benevolence is signaled in her repeated questioning of Bernice regarding if she will do, quote, exactly as she says, end quote, as well as her assumption of total control and her micromanaging Bernice's expressions and appearance. Marjorie's attention to Bernice is akin to a director making decisions in costuming and performance. Her musings reflect conscious staging. I view Marjorie's creation of a, quote, society vampire, end quote, in Bernice and her suggestion of the catchy idea of bobbing her hair as, ultimately, Marjorie intentionally setting the stage for a dramatic conclusion. In this reading, the final act of Bernice is not so much a response to sudden vengeful feelings, but is instead pre-planned theatricality and signals the final defining characteristic of the Marjorie archetype, an enactment of performative grandeur or dramatic disruption of normalcy in order to extricate or distract herself from constraints placed upon her. The character of Ardita Farnham exists as a valuable expansion and meditation upon themes so celebrated in Bernice Bobs Her Hair. Ardita could easily be confused with Marjorie herself. She's presented as a, quote, slender and supple young woman with a spoiled, alluring mouth, end quote, who blames her high-class upbringing for her bad disposition. Despite her oft-mentioned beauty, Ardita is constructed as a character who values mental acuity. Before her beauty is even mentioned, Fitzgerald notes that Ardita is, quote, reclined in a wicker settee reading The Revolt of Angels by Anatole France, end quote. This scene serves two functions. For one, the reading of French literature and its earlier placement in the introduction to Ardita's character implies her recognition of the importance of intellectual pursuit. And the title of the work she reads signals her impending revolt. Seen as an angel for her beauty, Ardita's revolt will ultimately emphasize mental over physical qualities. Of course, Ardita's convictions are similar to Marjorie's assertion that she hates dainty minds. Well, one gets the sense that whereas Marjorie pursues the ability to be intellectual and to use her beauty to allow herself that opportunity, Ardita instead seeks out the ability to imagine, to conjure up fantasies with a man that she feels intellectually equal to. Ardita clearly adheres to the Marjorie archetype's tenet that beauty and intelligence are inextricably linked. Prior to the entrance of the so-called pirate, Ardita is practically defined by malaise. Her actions are described in words that seem to slow down or suspend time. She is surrounded by drowsy silence, and her slippers, quote, hang nonchalantly from her toes and intermittently regales herself by a faint application of her tongue of a half lemon, the other half of which rocks, quote, very gently to and fro at the almost imperceptible motion of the tide, end quote. Perhaps more so than Marjorie, one gets the picture that Ardita's life is truly boring and unfulfilling, that the norms her uncle is imposing upon her are stifling her. The pirate farce that takes the majority of the story, then, can be seen as the dramatic performative disruption of Ardita's malaise. Despite the unexpected nature of the farce, one gets the sense that Ardita is certainly not opposed to it. She consistently thrills at moments that should terrify her. Upon the arrival of Curtis Carlyle / Toby Moreland, complete with demands that all crying babies be immediately drowned and all males put in double irons, Ardita digs her hands, quote, excitedly down into the pockets of her dress and is speechless with astonishment, end quote. Words that can very easily be read as components of either positive or negative reaction. The former seems to be the case, however, as she classes her kidnapper as a, quote, romantic figure with towering self-confidence and with a detectable hesitancy just under the surface, end quote. She denies being afraid, instead responding to her kidnapper with a, quote, conscious coolness and a supple swinging walk, end quote. Her calm and collected reaction can be seen as her acceptance of the unexpected escapade as a hoped-for extrication from her uncle's ship, a ship that literally and figuratively carried her towards the fulfillment of her uncle's expectations. This farce is exactly what Ardita has been waiting for all along. It functions as an escape from the reality that Ardita describes as going, quote, from man to man, restless, impatient, month by month, getting less acquiescent and more dissatisfied, end quote. Ultimately, this causes her to fall in love with the romanticized imaginations of the fake pirate. In Toby, she receives an answer to her initial hopes. In him, she has a man that will allow her the intellectual and imaginative freedom she longs for. In the final line, she kisses him softly in the illustration, thus wedding the reality of him to the fantasy that he created and that she has dreamt of. The Marjorie archetype is a tool that should not be limited to these two stories. While it has its roots in Bernice Bobs Her Hair, it reveals a component of Fitzgerald's fictional constructions that certainly transcends that single tale. Further research can make use of this archetypal theory in order to analyze and exploit other characters that fall under the more reductive identity of flapperdom. In freeing them from this historical context, I assert that a more nuanced and individualistic understanding of their respective characters can be constructed. The archetype may also be used as a tool with which to approach several of Fitzgerald's lesser discussed stories, many of which feature characters that may be analyzed through their adherence to or rejection of that archetype. In this way, scholars may begin to address the overwhelmingly large body of Fitzgeraldian work that has, up to this point, been met with a dearth of criticism. And that's the end of my presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. So our final presentation is actually a group of three. We have Abby Whitley, Esme Richardson Owen, and Johannes Wittegren. So the three of you, the floor belongs to all three of you.
Thank you very much. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for having us. My name's Abby, and I, along with my classmates Esme and Johannes, have done a corpus stylistic analysis of similes used by F. Scott Fitzgerald, Ernest Hemingway, and Gertrude Stein. Our research questions are, to what extent, if any, does the use of simile vary between Fitzgerald, Hemingway, and Stein? And what, if any, semantic variation exists in the topic and image of similes used by Fitzgerald as compared to Hemingway and Stein? This project began as a simple study in a corpus linguistic class using the LNU lost generation corpus. However, we decided to focus on similes for two reasons. One, because Fitzgerald is known for his masterful use of figurative language, and two, because similes work better in a corpus linguistic study, which I'll explain further in the methods section. Our dear professor, Professor Salmos's paper, Translating All the Sad Young Men into Swedish, he suggests that the use of like to create a simile produces a more powerful effect than metaphor due to the unfamiliar connection between the source and target domains. Because of this effect, we found it fitting to do a more thorough analysis of Fitzgerald's similes and see if they differ from similes of other writers of the time. Onto the materials and methods we used. The material used for analysis consists of novels written by Fitzgerald, Hemingway, and Stein. The Lost Generation corpus provided the Fitzgerald and Hemingway materials, whereas we collectively created the Stein novel corpus. The choice was made to restrict the materials to only novels in order to ensure that the same genre was compared for all three authors. Similes were selected for investigation as these often follow typical syntactical patterns that can be more easily searched for using partially automated methods than for other figurative language such as metaphor. We used 3 different search strings in order to extract similes from the novels. We looked for like similes, comparative as similes, and simple as similes. Of course, recall is not 100%. Some similes have been identified using these 3 search strings. However, we decided that it was an acceptable method to identify the most common simile constructions. After the data was extracted, we performed 2 rounds of categorization. This process was discussed at several points by the team, and difficult or opaque cases were categorized together. An example of how the semantic category was performed is provided below. In this example, station wagon was classified as M for transportation, and brisk yellow bug as L for life and living things. After categorization, the data was analyzed quantitatively, which will be presented in the next section by my colleague Johannes.
So moving on to our results, I'll try to avoid boring you with too many numbers, but if anyone wants them, you're free to contact me. So to address our first research question of whether one of the authors uses similes more than the others, the total number of similes found in each corpus was compared to the other corpora using log likelihood tests. And here you can see the total number of similes found for all 3 authors, with each construction in a separate color. And if we look at the number of similes per 100,000 words, we see that Fitzgerald used more than 6 times as many similes in his novels as Stein did in hers. And the test showed that the differences are statistically significant, meaning that they are incredibly unlikely to have occurred by chance. As we also saw in the previous slide, the authors seem to favor different constructions. We used chi-square tests to determine whether these differences were also significant, which they turn out to be. The largest effect sizes were found for how much Fitzgerald uses the like construction, how little he uses the as construction, and how much Stein uses the as construction. Furthermore, we counted the number of words in the image of each simile to see if one of the authors used longer similes than the others. We tested the results with an ANOVA test, which showed no significant difference, as the great majority of all simile images were between 2 and 6 words long for all 3 authors.
However, most of the very long similes are Fitzgerald's, who sets the record with a whopping 41 words in one of his images. Quote, England was like a rich man after a disastrous orgy who makes up to the household by chatting with them individually, when it is obvious to them that he is only trying to give back his self-respect in order to usurp his former power. Compare this to Stein, who has no particularly long similes in their novels. Many are short, like this one. I have in me a queer field, like dancing. Finally, we investigated the connections between the semantic categories of the topics and images from each author. Our network visualizations show which categories were the most prominent and which categories of words were typically compared to which. For Fitzgerald, humans, S2, were compared to many things, including physical objects, O, body parts, B, and supernatural things from the S category. For body parts, the connections go both ways. They are compared to plants and animals, L, and features of the universe, W, but their reverse is also true. Hemingway's network looks rather different. There are only 3 major categories, and the connections are not as varied. Stein's network is complex, with psychological states and processes, X, and human beings being compared to many things, but none of the categories are very frequent. So that's all from me, and I'll hand over the discussion to Esme.
Thank you, Johannes. So what can our quantitative results say about author style, if anything? As Johannes mentioned, our data shows that Fitzgerald uses simile in general, but particularly like similes at significantly higher rates than both Hemingway and Stein. Stein, however, uses comparative as at more than double the frequency of both Fitzgerald and Hemingway. However, one simile, as big as all the world, accounts for approximately 60% of all Stein's as similes, indicating that she has less semantic variation than Fitzgerald or Hemingway. We don't want to make any broad claims about author style on the basis of our small project. However, we feel it seems reasonable to posit that by nature of their syntactic structure, as similes create a more explicit comparison of topic and image. This more explicit comparison could be one stylistic feature that creates this straightforward style for which Stein is known. On the other hand, the use of like in the creation of simile allows for a more semantically complex and sometimes opaque comparison between topic and image to be made. And this could also be one way in which Fitzgerald creates such elaborate imagery in his writing, for which he is famed. On the question of variation, our findings demonstrate some notable differences in author style regarding how the images of similes are created. For instance, when the topic is human, Fitzgerald uses 15 different semantic categories in the construction of images, Hemingway 6 and Stein 14. However, important to note is that Stein uses many repeated phrases or singular and frequent similes. For Fitzgerald, the 5 most common use human subjects in the creation of topics, while body parts are used for number 4 and 5, most frequent, and images come from several semantic categories. Hemingway, on the other hand, also uses humans as a topic for his 3 most common similes topics, but no body parts appear. However, he tends to use objects more commonly in both topic and image, along with lexis from the domain of life. At first glance, Stein seems to create similes using quite abstract language, as her most commonly occurring topic is using lexis belonging to the domain of the psychological, often combined with simile images from the domain of the world and environment. However, as we stated previously, Stein tends to use quite repeated simile throughout our data, showing the least variation of the 3 investigated authors. So in conclusion, it appears from our data that Fitzgerald tends to create similes with topics containing more human and body part images. And interestingly, he is the only investigated author who regularly uses lexis related to food and drink in the creation of both topic and image. Our data also suggests that Fitzgerald constructs simile images using a wide variety of lexis belonging to different semantic categories. And these often favor lexis from the domain of the supernatural, emotional, and experience. Whereas in contrast, Hemingway creates imagery using tangible objects and human subjects. And again, Stein tends to go quite into the abstract and psychological, but often with a lot of repetition. So I hope you've enjoyed our short presentation, and thank you for listening.
Thank you for that presentation, you three. And with that, we are at the end of our showcase for today. We would be remiss, of course, if we didn't thank Dr. Linda Kuehl for funding this award for the past 2 decades. The Kuehl Fellowships began in 2000 to honor Fitzgerald scholar John Kuehl. Come on in, hon. Why not? Who passed away in 1998. This year, with Dr. Kuehl's permission, as many of us know, we have renamed the award the Kuehl Donaldson Fellowship to honor Scott Donaldson, who passed away in December of 2020. So I think I can speak for the society and those that attended today. This work is excellent, forward-thinking, thoughtful, and ultimately diverse. And I think that's what's really going to continue to help our society grow, the diverse approaches to Fitzgerald's work. So thank you all for your presentations. We wish we could be together in person to thank you and buy you a drink and shake your hand. But maybe in Fitzgerald Society conferences down the road, we will get to do that. So one more round of applause for our showcase fellows today.
I would just echo what Ross said. I think all of those are eminently pursuable. And in fact, I would encourage you to be thinking about developing those and submitting them to the review. I know Rick has a great paper in the current Fitzgerald review, and he and I have talked about pursuing one in the Journal of the American Short Story, which is another great venue you might think about. But all of those are great, and we're working with Laura on a project now as well. But again, the thing that I like the most, having kind of begun my studies in the era where everything was analyzing what the green on the end of the dock means, is just how absolutely different all of these papers are and how many different approaches there are. So please be in touch with us, and we look forward hopefully to seeing you in 2023. And we just want to remind folks out there that we will be back on Wednesday, July 7th at 1 p.m. with Sarah, Jim, and David for a fun round of Fitzgerald deep diving into the Jazz Age and beyond. And then on the 12th, where we will announce at the end of our Zooming around the globe where we will be meeting in 2023. And then hopefully those of you panelists, those of you out there in the audience will as well attend the writing and publishing workshop on July 14th. So until then, I hope everybody has a happy weekend. If it's a holiday weekend for you, enjoy it and be safe. If it's not, enjoy it and be safe anyway. And we will see you next week. Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Thank you, everyone.